Can we verify your doctoral degree before we proceed? I asked the question during the meeting. I wasn't asking to embarrass anyone. I wasn't making an accusation. I was doing my job. As the senior technical lead, my responsibility was simple and unforgiving: make sure every assumption behind the project could survive scrutiny. The framework we were about to deploy, worth $1.1 billion, explicitly cited the CEO's PhD dissertation as its scientific foundation. If that credential failed, everything built on it failed too. Eric Dalton didn't answer right away. He stared at me, expression unreadable, then gave a thin, controlled smile. "That's not appropriate," he said. "We're here to discuss execution, not question leadership credentials. Let's stay aligned." Aligned. The room obeyed the word. Slides advanced. Conversations resumed. My question was treated like background noise that needed to be erased. I stayed quiet for the rest of the meeting, trying to understand how a routine compliance check had suddenly become insubordination. I'd spent years translating theory into systems that actually worked, fixing flawed assumptions, patching gaps no one wanted to acknowledge, absorbing blame when models broke in the real world. I wasn't visible. I was necessary. Eric Dalton was visible, celebrated, introduced everywhere as Dr. Dalton. His authority came wrapped in titles and confidence, not deliverables. He spoke in certainties. He didn't like footnotes. A few hours later, HR showed up. No warning, no performance review, no explanation tied to policy. Just a scripted message about organizational fit and disruptive questioning. When I asked directly if I'd violated any technical or ethical guideline, the answer was carefully hollow. This decision comes from executive leadership. Leadership, apparently, didn't like verification. I left carrying nothing but personal items and a growing sense that the timing wasn't emotional, it was strategic. That night, I accessed the project approval archive, something I was still entitled to as the original technical authority. I followed the documentation trail past summaries and decks to the core justification. There it was, in plain language. The project's scientific validity was anchored directly to Eric Dalton's doctoral dissertation. Not referenced, not supplemental, foundational. In that moment, the shock finally settled into clarity. I hadn't been fired for asking the wrong question. I'd been removed for asking the only one that mattered. If this moment made your stomach tighten a little, you're not alone. Have you ever questioned something that didn't add up and been told to stay quiet? What do you think about my doubt? Was it out of line? Or was it necessary? Let me know where you're listening from. And if this story resonates, consider subscribing, because this was just the first crack in something much bigger. I didn't remember my years at the company as a highlight reel. They came back to me in fragments, usually when something broke. A model that worked perfectly on paper, but collapsed under real data. An assumption that looked elegant in a slide deck and dangerous in production. That was where I lived, inside the gap between theory and reality. I had never been the loudest person in the room. I was the one who stayed after meetings, rechecking numbers, rewriting logic, making sure the system didn't embarrass us later. When early simulations failed, I fixed them. When edge cases appeared, I absorbed them. I didn't argue about credit because the work itself was the point. Someone had to make it run. Eric Dalton never touched that layer. He floated above it, wrapped in certainty and titles. He loved being introduced as Dr. Dalton, loved hearing his own research referenced, even when no one could quite explain where it lived. When questions surfaced, he didn't answer them. He smiled and said, "Trust the vision." That phrase ended more discussions than any data ever could. At first, I told myself it was normal. Executives delegate. Visionaries don't debug. But small details kept nagging at me. No one had ever seen the original dissertation that supposedly underpinned the framework. Citations looped back to summaries of summaries. References pointed to conference talks instead of peer review. It wasn't proof of anything, just a pattern that didn't feel solid. I raised concerns carefully, privately, always framed as technical housekeeping, each time. The response was the same impatience disguised as confidence. Eric hated questions that slowed momentum. He treated verification as hesitation, and hesitation as disloyalty. What hurt wasn't being dismissed, it was being erased. After the meeting, after HR, after the building was no longer mine, I pulled up the project records from home, not out of spite, out of habit. I wanted to understand what I'd missed. I wanted to see when the story had quietly shifted without me noticing, and who had decided I was no longer necessary. That's when I saw it, an internal update dated weeks before my termination. The technical authority field was blank. It shouldn't have been. I traced the history and felt something settle heavy in my chest. My name had been removed quietly, deliberately, long before I ever asked about the degree. The decision had already been made. The question hadn't ended my career. It had only revealed that I was no longer supposed to be there, long before I understood the rules had changed, or who had rewritten them, behind closed conversations and executive emails, without my consent, deliberately, silently. Years of building, minutes to erase, forever, after the termination. Nothing dramatic happened, no shaking hands, no angry calls, no urge to explain myself to anyone who had already decided not to listen. The quiet that followed felt deliberate, almost surgical. I didn't interpret it as shock. I took it as confirmation. I didn't open social media. I didn't draft a message to colleagues. I made coffee, sat down, and began doing what I had always done best, reviewing information carefully, without emotion. My access had been cut, but not everything vanished at once. Personal emails, archived documents, memos I had saved because they were relevant to my role. Everything I reviewed was lawful, ordinary, and boring, which was exactly how truth usually hides. At first, I wasn't searching for evidence. I was searching for sequence. I needed to understand the order of decisions, not the feelings behind them. The firing hadn't felt impulsive. It had felt prepared. That distinction mattered. As I read through old threads, patterns became visible, not accusations. Patterns. Discussions where my input stopped being acknowledged. Threads where my name was quietly removed from distribution lists. Conversations that referenced alignment, concerns without ever naming a problem. Each message alone meant nothing. Together, they told a very clean story. If I had stayed, I would have reached a point where I could no longer avoid a formal notation. The model had unresolved academic dependencies. That wasn't opinion, it was procedure. My role required me to flag risks that could compromise validation. Once documented, those risks would trigger external review. That wasn't sabotage, it was compliance. That realization changed everything. The termination wasn't punishment for speaking up, it was prevention. Removing me removed the obligation, without my signature. No one was forced to acknowledge what hadn't been verified. The system could keep moving, quietly, confidently, and incorrectly. I felt no anger when I understood that, only clarity. I kept reading. Buried deep in an internal archive was a memo dated months earlier, sent during the early planning phase of the project. It was short, precise, unemotional. I had missed it because it never reached my inbox. Academic validation required before full deployment. No follow-up, no confirmation, no closure. The requirement existed, documented and ignored. That single sentence explained the speed of my removal better than any argument could. Validation wasn't delayed. It was avoided. And I was no longer useful once I became someone who would insist it happen. I leaned back and let the silence do its work. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of alignment. Everything now made sense. The praise, the sudden distance, the irritation when I asked questions that demanded sources instead of slogans. I hadn't been fired because I failed. I had been removed because I wouldn't participate in pretending verification was optional. Understanding that gave me control. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to accuse. The system already contained the truth. It just hadn't been forced to look at it yet. And for the first time since the meeting, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding what came next. At this point, do you feel something is about to happen? I didn't investigate Eric Dalton. I didn't search his past, call universities, or look for people who might talk. None of that mattered yet. People lie in complicated ways. Data doesn't. So I went back to the only place where titles stop working the logic itself. I reopened the project framework from my personal archive. The version saved months before revisions blurred accountability. I stripped away the language meant for investors and focused on the structure underneath. Assumptions, dependencies, mathematical relationships that either held or collapsed. This was familiar ground. This was where I had always been most comfortable. The first issue appeared immediately. The foundational assumption referenced an original theoretical proof, cited as Eric Dalton's doctoral work. The proof wasn't attached. There was no appendix, no archived link, no independent replication. The model simply assumed the proof existed and moved forward, as if that assumption were settled fact. That alone wasn't criminal, it was sloppy. But sloppiness at this scale carried consequences. I followed the logic chain further. Variables were defined without boundary conditions. A core function relied on a simplification that invalidated its own conclusion. The methodology cited precedent but never demonstrated equivalence. These weren't stylistic choices. They were first-year mistakes, the kind corrected early or never made at all. I paused and reread the section slowly. This step assumes convergence under standard constraints. I said it out loud, letting it sound as hollow as it was. Standard according to whom no constraints were defined. No dataset supported the claim. The language relied on authority, not verification. I didn't need to know who wrote it to know something was wrong. But I knew anyway. A real doctoral dissertation doesn't read like that. It anticipates attack. It overexplains. It defends every leap because it expects to be challenged by people who want it to fail. What I was looking at avoided scrutiny entirely. It moved fast, confident no one would stop to check the ground beneath it. I documented each flaw methodically, not as accusations, just observations. Source not independently verifiable. Assumption lacks empirical boundary. Methodological shortcut invalidates result. Each note stood on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. At one point, I caught myself almost laughing, not out of humor, but recognition. I'd spent years compensating for these gaps without naming them, fixing downstream failures instead of questioning upstream truth. Titles had filled in the silence where data should have lived. This isn't rigorous, I said quietly. This is performative. That was the moment certainty replaced suspicion. Not because I had proven anything about Eric Dalton, but because I had proven something about the work. A real PhD doesn't leave holes like this. Not unintentionally, not repeatedly, not in the core. I didn't escalate. I didn't confront anyone. I did the one thing my role had always required when logic failed. I prepared documentation for compliance. The system didn't care about motive. It cared about inputs. When foundational data was missing, flags triggered automatically, validation pathways opened. External review became mandatory, no whistleblowing, no drama, just process doing what it was designed to do. I reviewed the compliance workflow carefully, almost respectfully. It was clean, impersonal, relentless. All it required was the absence of original data. And that absence was undeniable. At the end of my notes, I added a single line. Factual and restrained. The theoretical framework cannot be validated without the original doctoral source. I stared at it for a long moment before saving. That sentence didn't accuse anyone. It didn't challenge authority. It didn't even express doubt. It stated a condition. And conditions, once recorded, have consequences. For the first time since my termination, I felt completely steady. I hadn't acted out of resentment or revenge. I had acted out of alignment with the rules, with the data, with the system that had been built to protect against exactly this kind of failure. Titles could argue, power could resist, but the absence of evidence couldn't be negotiated. And once the system noticed that absence, it would do the rest on its own. I didn't report Eric Dalton. That decision was intentional, and it wasn't driven by fear or restraint. It came from something steadier than anger. Reporting a person invites argument. Documenting reality invites process. I had spent my career trusting process. even when people didn't deserve it. I opened the project record the same way I had hundreds of times before. No drama, no adrenaline, just structured fields waiting to be filled with facts. This wasn't a complaint channel. It wasn't an ethics hotline. It was a technical system designed to preserve integrity when personalities failed. I respected that design. The section I needed wasn't labeled accusation or concern. It was labeled validation status. The language mattered. So did the tone. I read the previous entries carefully, noting how others phrased uncertainty without assigning blame. This wasn't the place for conclusions. It was the place for conditions. I typed one sentence. The theoretical framework cannot be validated against an original dissertation. I paused before saving it. Not because I doubted the accuracy, but because I understood the weight. That sentence didn't mention Eric Dalton. It didn't reference titles or intent. It didn't speculate. It simply stated that a required source did not exist in the record. Validation, by definition, could not proceed. That was it. No attachments, no commentary, no escalation. What followed was quiet. Almost disappointingly so. The system accepted the entry and timestamped it. Nothing flashed. No alerts fired on my screen. I closed the file and stepped away, trusting the architecture to do what it was built to do. I knew how compliance workflows behaved once a foundational dependency was marked unresolved. The system didn't argue. It didn't negotiate. It routed. A flag like that automatically adjusted the project's risk profile. Validation checkpoints became mandatory. External review requirements surfaced without emotion. This was why I hadn't reported anyone. Reports invite defenses. Data invites verification. Hours later, the first automated notification was generated. Not to me, but to the risk management queue. The subject line was clinical academic validation pending. No names, no drama, just a status change that could not be ignored. I felt strangely calm reading it. Not relieved. Not vindicated. Calm. The process was now carrying the weight I had been holding alone. Whatever happened next would not be personal. It would be procedural. I didn't wait by my phone. I didn't refresh my inbox obsessively. I went for a walk, knowing that escalation, once triggered, moved at its own pace. Systems like this didn't rush. They unfolded. By evening, a second notice appeared in the shared workflow log. High academic risk. The words were impersonal, almost polite, but they carried authority no executive title could override. High risk meant review. Review meant documentation. Documentation meant answers. I thought about how easily this could have been avoided. One verified source. One archived dissertation. One clear response to a reasonable question. Instead, silence had been chosen, and silence had consequences. I hadn't accused Eric Dalton of anything. I still hadn't. The system would never say he lied. It would only state what could and could not be supported. In that distinction lived fairness. As I shut down my laptop, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel like I was fighting anyone. I felt aligned. With my role. With my ethics. With the quiet rules that protect institutions from collapsing under their own arrogance. Reality didn't need my voice raised. It just needed to be recorded once, accurately, and allowed to move forward that night. I slept without replaying conversations or rehearsing defenses. My responsibility had ended at accuracy. Everything beyond that belonged to the system and the people accountable to it. For years, I had absorbed uncertainty to keep projects moving. This time, I let certainty stand still. Whatever pressure followed would not be mine to manage. I had done the only ethical thing available to me. I had written down the truth and stepped aside, trusting that truth, once logged, would insist on being answered. And I knew, calmly, that silence would no longer protect anyone. Listen closely, the next small detail changed everything. The first request didn't come with drama. It arrived quietly, wrapped in neutral language, routed through channels that never cared about personalities. A third-party verification notice appeared in the system log, time-stamped and precise, asking for two things only the original doctoral dissertation cited in the project framework. and the academic verification records supporting it. No explanation, no accusation, just a request that assumed the documents already existed. That was when the tension began to rise. I wasn't copied on the request, but I saw the ripple immediately. Workflow indicators shifted, response deadlines tightened, the project status changed from stable to conditional. None of that happened because of me. It happened because the system had done what it was designed to do when a foundational dependency remained unresolved, within hours. Eric Dalton reacted. His first message wasn't addressed to compliance, it was addressed to leadership. He framed the situation carefully, calling the request a distraction driven by a disgruntled former employee. My name wasn't used at first, but the implication was obvious. He suggested the verification inquiry was retaliatory, unnecessary, and harmful to momentum. Momentum. That word again. By the afternoon, the tone hardened. A follow-up message demanded that the technical note be removed from the project record. "It is inaccurate and inflammatory," he wrote. "It does not reflect executive consensus." He never mentioned the missing dissertation. He never answered the request itself. He attacked the existence of the question. That told me everything. I watched the escalation from a distance, my involvement already complete. I wasn't contacted because I wasn't needed. The system wasn't asking me to explain anything, it was asking for documents. And documents either exist or they don't. Eric tried a different angle next. He questioned process. He implied procedural overreach. He argued that academic review had already occurred in principle. The words were confident. The substance was thin. Compliance systems don't respond to confidence. They respond to files. The requests didn't stop. A second verification notice appeared. This one broader, routed through risk management. It referenced the same missing materials, now flagged as time-sensitive. The language remained polite, impersonal, relentless. There was no space to argue motive, only a space to upload evidence. That was when Eric's frustration became visible. In a closed leadership thread, he escalated his rhetoric. He accused unnamed parties of undermining authority. He warned of legal consequences. He framed the inquiry as an attack on his credibility, not as a gap in documentation. Every response avoided the same problem, the absence of the dissertation itself. I felt the pressure building, not emotionally, but structurally. Each unanswered request increased risk weighting. Each delay triggered another automated reminder. The system didn't care that Eric was the CEO. It cared that a requirement remained unmet. Late that evening, a final clarification appeared in the compliance log. It was brief and decisive. This verification request originates from automated academic risk assessment. No individual complaint initiated this review. That sentence changed the entire dynamic. Eric could no longer point at me. He could no longer frame this as a personal vendetta. The review wasn't driven by a former employee. It was driven by process, by code, by rules he had signed off on when the project began. The next morning, the language in his messages shifted again. Less aggressive, more cautious. He asked for extensions. He suggested alternative documentation. He proposed summaries in place of originals. None of it satisfied the requirement. The system wasn't flexible on source material. I read the updates with a steady focus. This was the moment I had anticipated. Not with excitement, but with certainty. The escalation wasn't chaotic, it was orderly. Each step followed the last with mechanical logic. The system was asking questions because it had been taught to, and it would continue asking until answered. For the first time, I sensed real unease in Eric's responses. Not anger. Unease. Authority works best when it is unquestioned. Compliance exists to question quietly and persistently. When the two collide, authority often blinks first. I closed the log and stepped away again, resisting the urge to watch every update. The outcome no longer depended on my presence. It depended on whether reality could be produced on demand. The questions would keep coming. They always did. The response arrived the next morning, quietly uploaded into the verification thread as a scanned letter with a university letterhead I recognized immediately. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it would say. Still, when I finally read the single sentence highlighted by compliance, the tension sharpened into something undeniable. We have no record of this dissertation. That was it. No qualifiers, no ambiguity, no suggestion of delay or missing paperwork. Just absence, stated cleanly and formally by the institution Eric Dalton had cited for years. The system reacted before anyone else could. Status indicators shifted again. This time, visibly. What had been a pending verification turned into an unresolved dependency. What had been conditional became unstable. The question was no longer whether the documentation would arrive. It was why it never had. Eric didn't respond immediately, for several hours. There was nothing, no messages, no objections, no explanations. That silence felt different from before. It wasn't strategic, it was searching. When he did respond, the tone was defensive but measured. He claimed the university's archives were incomplete. He suggested older dissertations had been lost during digitization. "This is an administrative issue," he wrote, "not an academic one." The words were carefully chosen to reframe absence as inconvenience. Compliance replied with a neutral acknowledgement and asked for alternate proof. Certified copies, advisor confirmation, any contemporaneous record. None appeared, instead. Eric requested time. He framed it as courtesy, as respect for process. He argued that rushing verification would damage relationships. When that didn't work, the language shifted again. He warned of reputational harm. He hinted at legal exposure. He accused unnamed parties of acting in bad faith. I read each update with a steady focus. The tension wasn't emotional for me anymore. It was structural. Every response from Eric avoided the same point. He never produced the dissertation. He never named an advisor. He never referenced a defense date. He circled around the absence without ever entering it. Then came the threat. In a message routed to senior leadership and legal, Eric wrote that continued pursuit of this line of inquiry could result in litigation. He claimed defamation. He asserted that the verification process itself was abusive. The implication was clear: stop asking, or pay the price. The system did not react. Compliance acknowledged receipt and reiterated the requirement. Verification must be completed to maintain project coverage. The reply stated, "No commentary, no apology. Just a reminder of consequence." That was when the pressure peaked. Insurance entered the thread shortly after. Not with alarm, but with precision. They referenced the same missing documentation and explained, calmly, that coverage depended on verified academic foundations. Until verification was complete, the policy could not remain active. The wording was careful, almost sympathetic. Effective immediately, coverage was suspended. The project didn't collapse in that moment. It froze. Deployments paused. Approvals stalled. Financial commitments were placed on hold. Nothing dramatic happened outwardly, but internally. Everything stopped moving. A $1.1 billion initiative was suddenly operating without protection. Eric's response was immediate this time. He demanded clarification. He questioned authority. He insisted the suspension was premature. He asked for exceptions. None were granted. For the first time, he was no longer speaking from a position of control. He was reacting. I watched the escalation with a strange sense of distance. This wasn't exposure through scandal or accusation. It was exposure through absence. A missing document had become louder than any whistleblower ever could. By the end of the day, the tone of Eric's messages changed again. Shorter, less confident. He stopped threatening and started asking. Extensions. Alternatives. Temporary allowances. The system offered none. The dissertation hadn't disappeared recently. It had never existed in the way it was claimed. And now, with insurance withdrawn, the cost of that lie was no longer theoretical. I closed the thread, knowing the line had been crossed. Not by me. By reality finally being forced into view. The disappearance was complete, and everyone could see it. You might not believe what happens next, and I want to hear your reaction. When power senses danger, it doesn't retreat. It performs. Eric Dalton's response wasn't quiet damage control. It was visibility. Within hours of the insurance suspension, a polished statement appeared in the internal communications feed. Then, on external channels, shortly after, it spoke of confidence, continuity, and temporary technical misunderstandings. The phrase was repeated twice, as if repetition could turn it into truth. I read it without reaction. I wasn't the audience anymore. Investors were. The narrative was simple. The project was sound. The science was proven. A former employee had raised procedural noise, and automated systems had overreacted. There is no risk to core deliverables, the statement assured. Leadership remains fully aligned. Aligned. Again. Eric followed the statement with a series of meetings he called clarifications. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. The slides circulated anyway. They emphasized momentum, minimized dependency, and avoided the word dissertation entirely. Instead, they used substitutes legacy research, foundational work, proprietary framework, language designed to blur absence into abstraction. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Eric blamed the situation on a technical misunderstanding caused by overly rigid compliance triggers. In one meeting transcript I later reviewed, he said, "This is a systems issue, not a credibility issue." Someone asked whether the original academic source could simply be revalidated. He answered quickly, "It already has been." No one challenged him. No one asked how. The board didn't argue ethics. That was the surprising part. There were no speeches about integrity or values. No one accused Eric of deception. Instead, they narrowed the discussion until only one question remained. Can this project survive external academic review? It was asked calmly, without emphasis, not as an attack, as a filter. Eric answered first. He spoke about track records, market confidence, and execution history. He talked about innovation being misunderstood in early stages. He talked for several minutes without addressing the question directly. Then someone asked again. Slower this time. If an independent academic body reviewed the foundational methodology today, would it pass? The room shifted. Eric paused. It was brief, but it broke rhythm. He pivoted to alternatives. Reviews could be staged, context provided, methodology interpreted within industry norms. The answer remained adjacent, never centered. The board didn't interrupt him. They didn't debate him either. They waited. Eventually, the legal advisor spoke. Without verified source material, she said, the answer is no. No embellishment, no apology. That single word landed heavier than any accusation. It didn't condemn Eric. It condemned the structure holding the project together. Without external validation, partnerships stalled. Without partnerships, financing thinned. Without coverage, exposure multiplied. Eric tried once more. He suggested internal review panels. He offered expert testimonials. He proposed reframing the methodology as proprietary, not academic. Each suggestion was acknowledged, then set aside. None changed the core problem. I felt no rush of triumph watching this unfold. Only a cold satisfaction rooted in predictability. Power always panics the same way. It talks louder. It blames process. It avoids the question that cannot be answered. The board concluded without drama. The decision wasn't announced publicly. It didn't need to be. The answer had already done the work. The project could not survive external academic review. And everyone in the room understood what that meant. It meant timelines collapsing quietly, contracts paused without explanation, and confidence evaporating behind closed doors. It meant Eric Dalton's authority shrinking in rooms where his title once filled the space. No one announced his failure, but no one relied on him either. Silence replaced applause. I noticed how quickly language changed. Executives stopped quoting him. Emails stopped seeing him automatically. Decisions rerouted around his office, as if avoiding a structural weakness. Power doesn't vanish in a single moment. It erodes when it no longer answers necessary questions. What stayed with me was how clean it all was. No shouting, no courtroom threats carried through. Just a single unanswered requirement, and the consequences that followed it with mechanical patience. Watching it happen, I understood something I hadn't before. Truth doesn't need champions when systems are designed correctly. It doesn't need anger, only documentation. Eric Dalton had built his authority on certainty. The system had asked for proof. When proof didn't appear, certainty dissolved. I closed the update knowing the escalation wasn't finished. But the direction was set. Power had panicked, process had responded, and somewhere between the two, control had quietly shifted away from the man who once decided who was allowed to ask questions. That certainty never returned again. Administrative leave doesn't sound like punishment. It sounds temporary, procedural, almost polite. That was the phrase used when Eric Dalton was removed from daily operations. And the softness of it matched the moment perfectly. There was no announcement, no dramatic meeting, no warning bell. One morning, his authority simply stopped moving through the building. I learned about it the same way everyone else did, indirectly. A calendar invite disappeared. A standing meeting was reassigned. Decisions that once required his approval rerouted themselves without comment. No one explained why. No one needed to. The absence spoke with more discipline than any memo could have. There was no press release. That detail mattered. Companies issue statements when they want to control a story. Silence meant they didn't want one. Official channels remained clean, neutral, empty, internally. The message was just as quiet. Eric Dalton had been placed on administrative leave pending review. No adjectives, no defense, no attack. I checked the company website later that day. Not out of curiosity, but habit. Leadership pages are living documents. They reflect power in real time. His name was gone, not crossed out, not archived, simply removed as if it had never been there. Titles reshuffled. Reporting lines adjusted. The space where he had been filled itself without acknowledging the change. That was when the finality settled in. Administrative leave wasn't about fairness or reputation. It was containment, a way to stop further damage while answers were demanded elsewhere. Eric wasn't being judged publicly. He was being sidelined quietly because process had outrun personality. Behind that quiet shift, the larger consequence took shape. The project status updated again. This time without qualifiers. Frozen. Not delayed. Not paused for review. Frozen indefinitely. The $1.1 billion initiative that had driven hiring, partnerships, and forecasts now existed only on paper, without insurance coverage and without validated foundations. It could not legally move forward. No one argued with that outcome. There was nothing left to argue. Finance locked funds. Legal halted obligations. Partners were notified with carefully neutral language. Timelines dissolved into to be determined. The corporate phrase that usually means never. Eric Dalton didn't protest publicly. He couldn't. Administrative leave stripped him of voice as effectively as it stripped him of access. Any statement from him would have been personal. And this collapse was no longer personal. It was systemic. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen. Only a calm acknowledgement of sequence. This was what justice looked like when it wasn't trying to make a point. It didn't humiliate. It didn't dramatize. It corrected. People often imagine accountability as confrontation, but real accountability is quieter. It moves through systems, not emotions. It leaves no room for rebuttal because it isn't making an argument. It's enforcing a condition. The freeze changed everything downstream. Teams were reassigned, budgets rebalanced, future plans quietly rewritten without mentioning the project that once defined them. Eric's influence evaporated not because he was accused, but because nothing could proceed under his name. That was the coldest part of it. His downfall didn't come with a verdict or a headline. It came with absence. Absence of authority, absence of validation, absence of movement. As I watched the organization adapt, I understood the difference between revenge and resolution. Revenge demands acknowledgement. Resolution doesn't care if you're watching. Administrative leave was never the punishment. Irrelevance was. And once the project froze, permanently and without appeal, Eric Dalton became a footnote to a process that no longer needed him. Justice had arrived without raising its voice, and it stayed exactly as long as necessary. I closed my laptop that evening with a strange sense of balance. Nothing more needed to happen for the outcome to be complete. The system had reached its conclusion without asking for my approval or my presence. That was the point. Justice, when it is real, does not seek witnesses. It simply restores order, removes what does not belong, and continues forward as if disruption was always temporary. Silence followed, steady and final, leaving no space for appeal or revision afterward. The call came 2 days after the project freeze, from a number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. I didn't answer right away, not out of spite, out of instinct. When power shifts, timing matters. And I wanted to hear the tone before I heard the words. When I did pick up, there was no small talk. "Nina Clark," the voice said, measured and professional. "This is the board." No apology followed, no preamble about misunderstandings or regret. That told me more than any excuse could have. Boards don't apologize when they believe the process worked. They move forward. They explained the situation in clean terms. The project was frozen. External confidence was shaken. Insurance coverage remained suspended. Restarting anything would require rebuilding the technical foundation from the ground up. Then came the offer. Delivered without ceremony. "We want you to return as independent project lead. Not employee, not manager, independent." I let the silence stretch just long enough to be intentional. "Who would I be reporting to?" I asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. "You would report directly to the board." There it was. The sentence that inverted everything that had come before. They didn't say Eric Dalton's name. They didn't need to. His absence was already built into the structure of the offer. The role existed precisely because the old reporting lines could no longer be trusted. They outlined the scope clearly. Full authority over technical validation, control over methodology, power to halt progress if verification failed. No executive override, no political shortcuts. It was the same responsibility I had carried for years, finally matched with the authority that had always been missing. I didn't accept immediately, not because I was uncertain, but because this moment deserved clarity. "I won't be brought back to justify prior decisions," I said. "I'll only return to build something that can stand external review." "That's exactly why we're calling," one of them replied. The simplicity of that answer settled something in me. This wasn't reconciliation. It was recalibration. The system had failed, corrected itself, and now required someone who understood both the damage and the rules. I agreed. As the call ended, I felt the shift fully. Not triumph. Alignment. Power hadn't been handed to me as a reward. It had moved because it needed to. Authority flows toward competence when the cost of ignoring it becomes too high. Later that evening, I reviewed the revised governance structure. Eric Dalton's role was absent. Not reassigned. Removed. Decisions that once passed through his office now bypassed it entirely. I wasn't stepping back into an old hierarchy. I was operating outside it. There was a lesson in that. Subtle but sharp real leverage doesn't come from titles. It comes from being the point where progress stops or continues. I had always been that point. Now the organization acknowledged it. I didn't celebrate. I prepared. Returning meant more than restarting a project. It meant setting a new standard that couldn't be bent by confidence or charisma. I would document everything, validate everything, assume nothing. The same discipline that had ended my career once would now define the terms of its continuation. Before sleeping, I sent a single message confirming acceptance. No conditions, no demands, just agreement. The next phase would be harder, slower, and far less glamorous than what came before. But it would be real. And this time, no one would ask me to stay aligned at the expense of truth. Rebuilding began the moment authority and responsibility finally aligned. There was no ceremony, no announcement that marked my return. I logged in, reviewed the frozen architecture, and started dismantling what had never deserved to stand. Control didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as permission to act without asking. The first step was subtraction. I removed the theoretical layer that traced back to Eric Dalton's supposed research. Entire modules vanished. Not because they were malicious, but because they were unprovable. Assumptions that once passed as insight were stripped down to empty statements. If a claim couldn't be tested, it didn't belong. If a dependency couldn't be sourced, it was cut. What remained was quieter, smaller, and honest. From there, I rebuilt outward using real data, empirical models, verifiable inputs, constraints written explicitly instead of implied through confidence. Progress slowed, exactly as it should have years ago. Every result had to justify itself. Every conclusion had to survive review from people who wanted to break it. That wasn't punishment, that was discipline. Teams adjusted quickly. Engineers stopped guessing what leadership wanted and started focusing on what the system required. Meetings changed tone. Fewer declarations, more questions. Control doesn't need volume when structure is clear. Eric Dalton tried to reinsert himself within a week. The first attempt was indirect. A message routed through a senior advisor suggested his strategic insight might still be useful during transition. I declined without commentary. Insight without validation had already cost the project enough. The second attempt was more direct. He emailed me personally, framing his involvement as continuity. This project was my vision. He wrote, "It deserves protection from overcorrection." I replied with one sentence, "This project deserves verification." There was no response. The third attempt didn't reach me at all. Eric contacted legal, questioning the scope of my authority and the legitimacy of excluding him from decisions. Legal replied by forwarding the updated contract. His name wasn't on it. That was the final barrier. The new agreement had been written carefully. It didn't punish Eric. It didn't accuse him. It simply removed him. No advisory role, no veto power, no access rights. The project no longer recognized his existence. His influence ended not with confrontation, but with omission. I felt the shift fully then. Control wasn't about stopping him. It was about building something where he no longer mattered. As the system stabilized, external reviewers were brought in, not friendly voices, skeptics, academics with no stake in outcome. They challenged everything, and that was the point. Each successful defense strengthened the foundation. Each failure forced revision. Nothing moved forward without earning it. I worked longer hours than before, but the strain felt different. There was no background noise of appeasement, no need to translate truth into something palatable. Decisions landed where they should, based on evidence, not personality. Eric made one final attempt weeks later, requesting a meeting to clear misunderstandings. The request never reached my calendar. The governance filter rejected it automatically. By then, the project no longer resembled its original form. It was leaner, slower, stronger, and most importantly, it was real. That was the quiet victory, not the removal of a man, but the removal of a lie. When that happened, control didn't have to be enforced. It sustained itself. I closed the day's report knowing something irreversible had occurred. The project no longer depended on authority to survive. It depended on truth. And truth, once embedded into structure, doesn't ask permission to remain. Eric Dalton didn't resign. He didn't issue a farewell note or pivot to consulting. He simply vanished from the industry, the way people do when systems stop returning their calls. One quarter, he was referenced in meetings as context. The next, his name never surfaced at all. That disappearance felt deliberate, not vindictive. No one needed to explain what had happened. His absence carried enough information. Projects moved forward without mentioning him. New hires never learned who he was. Old ones stopped correcting them. Silence finished what process had started. I noticed the change most in how decisions were framed. Where executives once asked how Eric would respond, they now asked what the data supported. Where authority once settled arguments, evidence took its place. The organization didn't celebrate the shift, it absorbed it. I didn't feel relief so much as equilibrium. Revenge demands witnesses and applause. Justice doesn't. Justice restores balance and then gets out of the way. Nothing about Eric's fall required my participation anymore. And that was exactly the point. People assume exposure ends with confrontation, but this ended with omission. His ideas were replaced, his frameworks rewritten, his influence quietly deleted from shared memory. No warnings, no cautionary tale, just relevance removed. I kept working, rebuilding systems that could withstand scrutiny without needing anyone's confidence to prop them up. Each review passed felt less like victory and more like confirmation that the truth was finally doing its job on its own. One evening, after signing off on a validation report, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't carrying the story anymore. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement or apology. The outcome had already spoken. Eric Dalton hadn't been destroyed. He had been outgrown. I closed my laptop and said the words aloud. Not for emphasis, but for clarity. I didn't destroy Eric Dalton. I just stopped protecting a lie. The sentence didn't feel sharp, it felt complete. The story didn't need a villain anymore. And it didn't need a hero. It needed structure, truth, and the discipline to let both stand without interference. In the end, that was enough. I walked away calm. Not because I had won, but because nothing was left unresolved. When systems work, they don't need revenge. They need honesty, patience, and the courage to stop lying. That quiet ending followed me forward, steady, unburdened, and certain I would never trade it. I didn't win because I was smarter or louder. I didn't win because I fought harder. I simply stopped protecting something I knew wasn't true and let reality take its course. This story taught me that anger burns fast, but clarity lasts. There were moments of bitterness. Of course, years of work erased in minutes will do that to anyone. But the moment I chose calm over reaction, everything changed. I learned that self-respect is not about being seen as right. It's about being able to sleep at night, knowing you didn't betray your own values. This experience reminded me that systems don't collapse because of one bad person. They collapse because too many good people stay silent. You don't have to be dramatic. You don't have to be cruel. Sometimes, the most humane act is simply to tell the truth gently and step aside. If you're still here with me, thank you. Did you stay until the end because something in this story felt familiar? Have you ever doubted something at work but hesitated to speak up? If you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your story. And let me know, where are you listening from right now? If this story resonated with you, please consider leaving a comment, giving the video a like, or sharing it with someone who might need it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, told calmly and honestly, I invite you to subscribe. Sometimes, courage spreads quietly, one story, one voice, one listener at a time.